The millionaire checked out his restaurant dressed as a homeless man. What happened next shocked him. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The soft hum of conversation filled the air of the Golden Rose, mingling with the clinking of fine crystal glasses and the rustle of silk and linen. The restaurant gleamed under the glow of chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors and gilded mirrors that lined the walls. It was an environment designed to impress, to remind its guests that luxury was a privilege reserved for those who could afford it. At the heart of it all stood Henry Watson, the man who had built this empire of elegance from nothing. Henry leaned against the sleek mahogany bar, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He noted the couples sipping aged wine, the executives sealing deals over steak tartare, and the celebrities laughing too loudly at jokes meant to be overheard. The image of perfection was as curated as the menu, but Henry could see through it. He always had. For all its glittering perfection, Henry sensed a rot beneath the surface, a quiet arrogance that had begun to fester within his staff. He had heard rumors of their treatment of less fortunate patrons, whispers of disdainful looks, slow service, or outright refusals to seat anyone who didn't meet the unspoken dress code of wealth. At first, he had dismissed the claims as exaggerations, but doubt lingered. Tonight, his doubts solidified into certainty. From his vantage point at the bar, he watched an elderly man in faded clothes approach the hostess stand. The hostess, a young blonde with sharp cheekbones, plastered on a brittle smile that barely masked her discomfort. "Good evening," the man said hesitantly, his voice trembling. "I was wondering if I could get a table." Her eyes flicked over him, scanning the threadbare sleeves of his jacket and the worn soles of his shoes. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," she said smoothly, not bothering to check the reservation list. The man shifted awkwardly, his fingers clutching the strap of his frayed bag. "I don't mind waiting. I just need—" "I'm sorry, sir." Her voice hardened and her smile vanished. "We have a strict dress code." Before he could protest, 2 security guards flanked him, their imposing presence making it clear that his presence was unwelcome. Henry clenched his jaw, feeling a surge of anger. He had spent his life fighting against prejudice and inequality, only to see it thrive under his own roof. Watching the man shuffle out of the restaurant, his head bowed, Henry felt a knot of shame tighten in his chest. He needed to do something. The idea struck him suddenly, bold and reckless, but undeniable. He had built his empire by taking risks, and this would be no different. Henry pushed away from the bar and strode toward his office, his mind already forming the details of his plan. Inside the dimly lit office, he paced the room, his thoughts racing. He had always prided himself on seeing the truth beneath appearances, but tonight he had witnessed the consequences of failing to act. He needed proof, evidence of the rot that had taken root among his staff. And there was only one way to get it. Henry reached into the back of his closet and pulled out a tattered jacket, its seams barely holding together. He hadn't worn it in years, not since his days scraping by on odd jobs and borrowed change. As he slipped it on, the fabric felt foreign against his skin, a reminder of how far he had come and how easily he could return to nothing. He found a pair of worn-out jeans and scuffed boots, then mussed his hair until it stuck up in uneven tufts. A few dabs of dirt from a potted plant completed the transformation. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Gone was the confident businessman who commanded boardrooms and earned the respect of his peers. In his place stood a tired, forgotten man, a shadow of the person he had once been. His heart pounded as he stepped out of his office and into the alley behind the restaurant. The night air was cool, and he shivered despite himself. He pulled the jacket tighter around his shoulders, already feeling the weight of his disguise. As he walked down the street, he noticed the way people looked at him, or rather how they didn't. Their eyes slid past him, as if acknowledging his presence would taint their evening. A man in a tailored suit gave him a wide berth, and a woman clutched her purse more tightly as she passed. By the time he reached the entrance of the Golden Rose, Henry's resolve had hardened. He climbed the steps and pushed open the door, stepping into the golden glow of the restaurant. The transformation was immediate. Conversation slowed and heads turned. Eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in suspicion. The hostess blinked at him, struggling to hide her distaste. "Sir," she began, her voice already sharp, "you can't—" "I just need a place to sit," Henry interrupted, keeping his voice steady despite the storm of emotions roiling inside him. The hostess faltered for a moment, then recovered. "I'm sorry, but we don't allow loitering." "I'm not loitering," Henry said. "I just need a minute to rest. Please." The security guards appeared again, their expressions hard. "You need to leave," one of them said, stepping forward. Henry held his ground, but his voice cracked slightly when he spoke. "I'll be gone soon. I just need a glass of water." The guard's eyes narrowed, and he reached for Henry's arm. "I said, wait." The voice came from the far side of the room. Henry turned to see a young waitress approaching, Jenna, if he remembered correctly. Her steps were hesitant, but there was kindness in her eyes. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'll get him some water." The guards hesitated, glancing at the manager, who was watching the scene unfold with an annoyed frown. "Make it quick," the manager snapped. Jenna led Henry to a small table in the corner, away from the other guests. She returned moments later with a glass of water and set it down in front of him. "Thank you," Henry said, his voice thick with gratitude. She gave him a quick smile, but didn't linger. Henry watched her go, a flicker of hope breaking through his anger. But as he sipped the water, he saw the manager whispering to the guards, their eyes darting in his direction. He wouldn't be welcome here much longer. As he finished the last drop of water, Henry knew this was only the beginning. Henry sat in the dim corner of the Golden Rose, his fingers wrapped around the now empty glass of water. He felt the weight of the stairs pressing down on him, the air around him thick with judgment. Conversations had resumed, but every so often he caught someone glancing his way, a flicker of curiosity quickly replaced by disdain or dismissal. He exhaled slowly, trying to maintain his composure. The glass trembled slightly in his hands, not from nerves, but from the simmering anger that boiled just beneath the surface. The faces of the staff, the manager, and the security guards swam in his mind, each one a reminder of the rot he had seen growing in his establishment. But he couldn't act yet. Not until he'd seen the full extent of it. The footsteps approaching his table broke his thoughts. Jenna returned, carrying a napkin and a small plate of leftover bread. She set them down quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being seen. "Eat this quickly," she whispered, her voice low. "They're already watching you." Henry looked up at her, searching her face for sincerity. Her eyes darted nervously, and her lips were pressed into a thin line. She was afraid, but not for herself. "Thank you," he said softly, his words carrying more weight than he intended. She hesitated for a moment before retreating, leaving him alone once more. Henry broke off a piece of bread, chewing slowly as his mind worked. Jenna's small act of kindness stood in sharp contrast to the hostility around him. It gave him hope that not everyone within these walls had succumbed to prejudice. But that hope was short-lived. The manager appeared at his table, looming over him with crossed arms and a sour expression. "You've had your water," he said flatly. "Now it's time to leave." Henry swallowed his bite, wiping his mouth with the napkin Jenna had given him. "I'm not causing any trouble," he replied evenly. "I'm just trying to rest for a moment. You're making the other guests uncomfortable." Henry glanced around the room. A few patrons turned away quickly, pretending not to listen. Others openly watched, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to disgust. "Is that what this is about?" Henry asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. "You're worried about appearances?" "I'm worried about running a business," the manager snapped. "This isn't a shelter. You need to leave." Henry didn't move. The manager's eyes hardened, and with a sharp gesture he called over the security guards. "Escort him out." The guards stepped forward, their heavy footsteps echoing in the quieted room. Henry stood slowly, meeting their eyes without flinching. "You don't need to do this," he said, his voice measured. "I'm not causing a scene." "You are now," one of the guards said, grabbing Henry's arm. The touch sent a spark of indignation through him. He jerked his arm free, and the motion caused the glass to tip over, spilling water across the table. Gasps rippled through the room. "Sir, you need to leave now," the guard barked, reaching for him again. "Wait," Jenna's voice rang out, sharp and unexpected. She hurried over, positioning herself between Henry and the guards. "He hasn't done anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling but determined. The manager's face darkened. "Jenna, stay out of this." "No," she said firmly. "You're treating him like dirt for no reason. It's wrong." Henry saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw resolve. She wasn't backing down. "Fine," the manager said coldly. "You can leave too." Jenna's breath hitched, but she squared her shoulders. "If that's what it takes." The guards hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Henry placed a hand on Jenna's shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'll go." "No," she whispered back. "You shouldn't have to." But Henry stepped past her, keeping his head high as he walked toward the door. The guards followed closely, making sure he left the premises. Outside, the night air hit him like a slap. He turned back, looking at the glowing windows of the restaurant. Jenna stood near the entrance, her arms wrapped around herself as if bracing against the cold. Henry gave her a slight nod, a silent promise that this wasn't over. Then he walked away. The next day, Henry returned. This time, he didn't even make it through the door. The security guards spotted him the moment he stepped onto the property. "You again?" one of them said, stepping forward with a sneer. Henry held up his hands in mock surrender. "I just need a moment." "You had your moment yesterday. Now leave before we call the cops." Henry's jaw tightened. "Is this how you treat everyone who doesn't fit your mold? Or is it just people like me?" The guard's eyes narrowed. "People like you? Black, poor, not worth your time. Get off the property." Before Henry could respond, a cup flew past him, splashing coffee across his chest. He looked up to see a well-dressed man smirking at him. "Watch where you're going, trash," the man said, brushing past. Laughter erupted from a nearby table. Henry stood frozen for a moment, his fists clenching at his sides, but he forced himself to turn and walk away. He hadn't expected this to be easy, but he hadn't expected it to cut so deep. Later that evening, Jenna found him sitting near the alley behind the restaurant. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, handing him another cup of water. Henry looked up at her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Why are you helping me?" "Because it's the right thing to do." Her answer was so simple, yet it carried a weight that settled in Henry's chest. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Neither do you," she replied. "But here we are." Henry smiled faintly, the first real smile he'd managed all day. "Thank you," he said. But as Jenna left, Henry's resolve only grew stronger. He wouldn't let this stand. This was only the beginning. Henry stood at the edge of the alley, staring at the glowing windows of the Golden Rose. The restaurant's facade shimmered under the streetlights, its elegance masking the rot festering beneath the surface. His fingers curled into fists at his sides as the echoes of yesterday's humiliation rang in his ears. The laughter, the sneers, the coffee dripping down his chest. It wasn't the insults that haunted him most. It was the looks. Those indifferent, dismissive glances that reduced him to something less than human. He had worked his entire life to rise above such judgment, to build something that commanded respect, yet, in a single evening, he had been reminded of the fragility of his position. But fragility wasn't the same as weakness. Henry turned away from the restaurant and started walking. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay there. Not yet. The night air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His thoughts churned, each step fueling his anger and determination. By the time he reached his apartment, his decision was made. Inside, he stripped off the tattered clothes and stood in front of the mirror. The face staring back at him was tired and unshaven, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter than ever. He grabbed a towel and began wiping away the grime, his reflection slowly transforming back into the man he truly was, the man who refused to let this injustice stand. The next morning, Henry sat in his office staring at the stacks of reports and invoices littering his desk. The polished wood and leather furniture seemed to mock him, a reminder of the distance between his world and the one he had stepped into the night before. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Jacob, I need you to do something for me." Jacob Larson was Henry's most trusted confidant, a private investigator who had helped him more than once in the past. "Of course, Mr. Watson," Jacob said. "What's going on?" "I need you to look into the staff at the Golden Rose. All of them. Background checks, prior complaints, everything." There was a brief pause before Jacob replied. "You think something's going on?" "I know something's going on." While Jacob worked, Henry focused on the changes he would make. He spent hours drafting plans for a complete overhaul of the restaurant, from its decor to its policies. The thought of tearing down the toxic culture that had taken root within its walls gave him focus, but it didn't dull the sting of what he had experienced. That night, unable to sleep, he returned to the restaurant, not as Henry Watson, the owner, but as a man the staff had discarded. The moment he stepped inside, the tension was palpable. The same hostess from before spotted him and immediately reached for the phone. "Sir, you can't be here." "I just need a few minutes," Henry said, his voice steady. The manager appeared, his face darkening when he saw Henry. "You again?" He gestured for the guards. "Get him out of here." Henry didn't resist this time. He let them drag him outside, their hands gripping his arms tighter than necessary. But he didn't leave. Instead, he lingered by the alley, watching through the kitchen windows as the staff bustled about, laughing and chatting as if nothing had happened. He spotted Jenna carrying a tray of dishes, her expression tense and guarded. She was the only one who had shown him kindness, yet even she seemed powerless to change the culture of the place. It was then that Henry knew this wasn't just about the staff. It was about the system that allowed this behavior to flourish. The following day, Henry met with Jacob in his office. "You were right," Jacob said, placing a folder on the desk. "It's worse than you thought." Henry opened the folder, scanning the pages inside. Complaints of discrimination, employees fired without cause, rumors of bribery and favoritism. It was all there, a damning indictment of the toxic environment he had unknowingly allowed to grow. His stomach turned as he read through the reports. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were patterns, deeply ingrained in the culture of the restaurant. "What do you want to do about it?" Jacob asked. Henry looked up, his jaw set. "Burn it down." The next evening, Henry returned to the restaurant, this time in his true form. He wore a tailored suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. The staff barely recognized him as the same man they had thrown out the day before. The hostess's eyes widened. "Mr. Watson, I didn't know you were coming tonight." "Clearly," Henry said, brushing past her. He walked through the restaurant, his presence commanding attention. Conversations hushed and heads turned as he made his way to the center of the room. "Attention, everyone," he said, his voice carrying across the space. The staff froze. The manager stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Watson, is something wrong?" "Yes," Henry said, "and it ends tonight." He turned to address the room. "I've owned this restaurant for years. I built it to be a place of excellence, a place where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. But that's not what I saw last night." Whispers rippled through the crowd, but Henry didn't stop. "What I saw was a culture of arrogance, discrimination, and cruelty, and I won't stand for it." The manager opened his mouth to protest, but Henry cut him off. "You're fired," he said, his voice ringing out like a hammer on steel, "and so is anyone else who believes they're too good to serve a glass of water to someone in need." Gasps filled the room. The manager sputtered, but Henry ignored him, turning to the security guards. "You two, gone." The guards exchanged nervous glances before hurrying out the door. Henry's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Jenna. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, but there was a flicker of hope behind the fear. "This restaurant will close for renovations," Henry continued. "When it reopens, it will be a place where everyone is welcome. No exceptions." He paused, letting his words sink in. "If you can't live up to that standard, leave now." No one moved at first. Then, one by one, some of the staff began to slip away, their faces tight with anger and shame. When the room was still, Henry turned to Jenna. "Stay," he said quietly. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. That night, Henry sat in his office, the weight of the day settling over him. He had taken the first step, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Rebuilding wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't afraid of hard work. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. This was just the beginning. The golden glow of the Golden Rose had vanished. Its doors were shut, the chandeliers dimmed, and the hum of conversation that once filled the space was replaced by silence. Outside, the restaurant's imposing facade looked almost ghostly, its grandeur muted under the pale light of the street lamps. The bold letters of its name seemed heavier now, weighed down by the shame of what had transpired within its walls. Henry stood at the entrance, keys in hand, staring up at the building that had been both his triumph and his failure. The silence surrounding him felt deafening, yet within his chest, his heart pounded like a war drum. The memory of the previous night's events played over and over in his mind. The gasps, the stunned expressions, the exits made in shame or anger. He had burned bridges and severed ties, but the fire had only just begun. The click of the lock echoed in the empty street as Henry opened the door. He stepped inside, the sound of his footsteps bouncing off the marble floors and high ceilings. The restaurant was frozen in time, as if the air itself held its breath. Half-folded napkins and abandoned glasses still lingered on the tables, remnants of the chaos he had unleashed. Henry moved through the room slowly, running his fingers along the backs of the velvet chairs and the edges of the polished tables. It was strange how empty the place felt without the chatter and laughter that once defined it. Strange, but fitting. He reached the far end of the dining hall and turned to face the space, letting the weight of it settle over him. This was where it had all fallen apart, and this was where it would be rebuilt. But first, he needed to strip it down to its foundation. His thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the door. Jenna stepped inside, her eyes wide as they adjusted to the dim light. She hesitated, lingering by the entrance as if unsure whether she belonged there. "I thought I locked that," Henry said, his voice softer than he expected. Jenna gave a nervous smile and stepped closer. "You gave me a key, remember?" Henry blinked, then nodded. "Right." She paused, scanning the room. "It feels different." "It is," Henry replied, "and it's going to be even more different soon." Jenna bit her lip. "I just wanted to see if you were okay. Yesterday was a mess," Henry finished for her. "Necessary," Jenna corrected. Henry allowed himself a small smile. "I'm glad you think so, because it's not over." Jenna tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this isn't just about firing a few bad apples." Henry gestured to the room around them. "It's about changing everything, how this place operates, who it serves, what it stands for." Jenna's eyes widened. "You're serious?" "As serious as I've ever been." She exhaled slowly, as if the enormity of the task had just hit her. "So, what now?" "Now," Henry said, "we tear it all down." The next week was a whirlwind of activity. Contractors arrived to strip the restaurant to its bones, ripping up carpets, removing furniture, and taking down the gilded mirrors. The sound of drills and hammers filled the air, drowning out the echoes of its former elegance. Henry was there every day, supervising the work and sketching out ideas for the new design. The opulence was gone, replaced by clean lines and open spaces. He wanted the restaurant to feel welcoming, not intimidating, a place where people could gather without fear of judgment. Jenna stayed by his side, organizing schedules, ordering materials, and helping to sort through applications for new staff. Her determination impressed Henry, but more than that, he was struck by how quickly she adapted to her new role. "You're good at this," he said one evening as they sat reviewing blueprints. "Good at what?" Jenna asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Managing," Henry replied. "You've got a head for it." Jenna's cheeks flushed. "I'm just trying to keep up." "Well, you're doing more than that," Henry said, "and I want you to keep doing it. Officially." Jenna's eyes widened. "Are you offering me a promotion?" Henry grinned. "Call it a trial run." Her lips parted in surprise, but before she could respond, the door swung open. Jacob entered, carrying a stack of papers. "Bad timing?" he asked. "Perfect timing," Henry said. "What did you find?" Jacob dropped the papers on the table. "It's worse than we thought." Henry flipped through the documents. Complaints of discrimination, misconduct, and even harassment. Each page told another story of cruelty and neglect. His stomach churned. "They thought they could get away with this," Henry muttered. "They thought no one would notice." They were right, Jacob said. Until now. Henry closed the folder and looked up at Jenna. This is why we're doing this. Not just to fix the restaurant, but to make sure this never happens again. Jenna nodded. I'm in. The grand reopening was still weeks away, but the transformation was already making headlines. News outlets picked up the story, dubbing Henry's decision a radical reinvention. The media attention brought praise, skepticism, and everything in between. Former staff members lashed out, accusing Henry of overreacting and ruining lives. Others tried to defend their actions, blaming policies or claiming ignorance. Henry ignored it all. His focus remained on the future. As the weeks passed, the restaurant began to take shape. The chandeliers were replaced with softer, warmer lighting. The velvet chairs were swapped for simple but elegant wooden seating. Local artists contributed paintings that celebrated diversity, and the new menu featured dishes from a variety of cultures. But the most important change was invisible. Henry made it clear that respect and inclusivity weren't just ideals, they were requirements. Every new hire went through sensitivity training, and policies were rewritten to ensure fairness at every level. By the time the reopening approached, the restaurant was unrecognizable, and so was Henry. He had shed the last remnants of the man who had stood in that alley, drenched in coffee and humiliation. But he hadn't forgotten, and he never would. On the eve of the reopening, Henry stood in the empty dining room taking it all in. The hum of conversation hadn't returned yet, but it would. And this time, it would sound different. Jenna joined him, holding a clipboard. Everything's ready, she said. Henry nodded. Good. You nervous? Henry considered the question, then shook his head. No, he said, not anymore. Because tomorrow wasn't just a new beginning for the restaurant, it was a statement, and Henry was ready to make it. The early morning light spilled through the windows of the Golden Rose, illuminating the transformed space. The once opulent dining room had shed its intimidating grandeur, replaced by an understated elegance. Soft, earth-toned walls framed the room, adorned with paintings and photographs donated by local artists, images of unity, diversity, and resilience. The tables, now simple yet polished, were arranged in a way that encouraged conversation rather than isolation. Henry stood at the entrance, taking in the final touches before the grand reopening. It was the first morning the restaurant had felt alive again, even without a single guest seated. The aroma of freshly baked bread lingered in the air, and the faint hum of kitchen activity provided a comforting backdrop. Yet, despite the visual changes, Henry knew the real transformation was still underway. The sound of footsteps echoed behind him. "Mornin', boss." Henry turned to see Jenna approaching, clipboard in hand and determination etched across her face. She wore a neatly pressed uniform that matched the new staff attire, comfortable yet professional. "You're here early," he said. "So are you," she replied with a small smile. "But I guess that's to be expected today." Henry nodded. Today was more than an opening. It was a test. Months of planning, rebuilding, and redefining what the Golden Rose stood for had led to this moment. But even as the doors prepared to open, shadows of the past lingered. The weeks leading up to this day had tested Henry's patience, resources, and resolve. Hiring new staff had been the first and most grueling hurdle. The initial interviews had been a sobering reminder of how ingrained discrimination could be. One applicant, a polished young man with an impressive resume, had flinched when Henry mentioned the new inclusivity training. "So, we're prioritizing social experiments now?" the man had asked. Henry's response had been immediate. "No, were prioritizing decency. The man hadn't gotten the job. Instead, Henry and Jenna focused on building a team that reflected the restaurant's new mission. Among the hires were Carla, a single mother rebuilding her life after leaving an abusive relationship; Amir, a refugee chef with years of experience but no formal training; and Teresa, a young woman who had dropped out of college to care for her ailing grandmother. Each hire carried a story, stories that now form the foundation of the Golden Rose. But not everyone had embraced the changes. Several former employees had launched a smear campaign against Henry, accusing him of exploiting social justice issues for publicity. Online reviews claimed the restaurant had lost its class, and some media outlets questioned whether Henry's changes were sustainable or simply a temporary stunt. The backlash only fueled his determination. "It's easy to hide behind labels and expectations," Henry had told Jenna during one of their late-night meetings. "But this place is going to prove that appearances don't define worth." The restaurant's transformation extended beyond its walls. Henry had reached out to local organizations and charities, partnering with shelters and community programs to offer free meals and job training programs. The announcement of a charity banquet to celebrate the reopening had drawn attention, both praise and skepticism. "I don't care what they think," Henry had said after reading one particularly biting article. "Let them come and see for themselves." The banquet was set to feature chefs from diverse backgrounds, each preparing dishes that told a story. Henry wanted it to be more than a meal. He wanted it to be a statement. Now, as the doors prepared to open, Henry couldn't help but feel the weight of expectations pressing down on him. Jenna interrupted his thoughts. "The first guests will be here in an hour. Are we ready?" "As ready as we'll ever be," Henry replied. But even as he spoke, doubts lingered. What if the changes weren't enough? What if people saw the new Golden Rose and still dismissed it, or worse, rejected it outright? He pushed the thoughts aside as the new staff gathered in the dining room. Henry stepped forward. "Today isn't just the reopening of this restaurant. It's the beginning of something bigger. Each of you is here because you've shown not just skill, but heart. That's what will set us apart." He scanned their faces, seeing nerves but also determination. "We're not here to impress the critics," he continued. "We're here to change how people see each other, one table, one plate at a time." Jenna led the applause that followed, and for the first time that morning, Henry felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. The doors opened at noon. Guests trickled in, some curious, some skeptical, and a few returning patrons who had heard about the changes and wanted to see them firsthand. Henry watched from a distance as the staff worked seamlessly. Carla greeted guests with warmth, Amir prepared dishes that earned murmurs of approval, and Jenna moved through the room, keeping everything running smoothly. But not everyone welcomed the changes. One former patron, a man in an expensive suit, approached Henry with a tight smile. "It's different," the man said, his eyes scanning the room. "That's the point," Henry replied. The man raised an eyebrow. "You'll lose business catering to the wrong crowd." Henry met his gaze without flinching. "Then it's business worth losing." The man left without ordering. As the evening approached, the charity banquet began. The room filled with guests from all walks of life, wealthy donors, community leaders, and people who had benefited from the restaurant's outreach programs. The chefs presented their dishes, each one accompanied by a story that resonated with the audience. Henry took the stage near the end of the night, the room falling silent as he addressed the crowd. "This restaurant was built on the idea that food brings people together," he began. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of what that truly means." He paused, scanning the faces before him. "We forgot that dignity and respect shouldn't be reserved for the privileged. That kindness isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. Tonight isn't just about reopening these doors, it's about tearing down walls." Applause erupted, but Henry wasn't finished. "This isn't the end, it's only the beginning, and we hope you'll join us." By the time the last guest left, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He stood at the entrance, watching as Jenna said goodbye to the final group of guests. When she turned back to him, her eyes shone with excitement. "We did it," she said. "We did," Henry agreed. But as he locked the doors for the night, he knew the real work was only just beginning. The night of the charity banquet arrived with an air of tension and expectation. Outside, the Golden Rose, a red carpet stretched across the sidewalk, bordered by velvet ropes and flashing cameras. Journalists and photographers gathered near the entrance, eager to document the restaurant's grand reopening after weeks of controversy and speculation. Inside, the newly transformed dining room glowed warmly under soft lights, the colors of earth and wood grounding the space. The scent of spices and freshly baked bread drifted through the air, mingling with the hum of conversation. Henry stood near the entrance, his tailored suit immaculate, but his hands slightly trembling. For weeks, he had poured his soul into this moment, transforming not just the restaurant, but himself. Yet, as the first guests began to trickle in, doubt whispered in his mind. Would they see what he saw? Would they understand what he was trying to create? Jenna appeared at his side, clipboard in hand. "Everything's set," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flicker in her eyes. Henry nodded but said nothing. "You're thinking too much," Jenna added, nudging him lightly. "Just breathe. They're here because they believe in this." Henry forced a smile. Jenna's unwavering support had been a lifeline throughout this process, and her presence grounded him now. "Let's make it count," he said, straightening his tie. The guests represented a patchwork of society. Wealthy philanthropists and business leaders mingled with activists, teachers, and volunteers from local shelters. At one table sat a group of refugees who had benefited from the restaurant's new outreach programs. At another, a pair of single mothers, dressed modestly but radiating excitement at being part of something so grand. The contrast was deliberate. Henry wanted the room to reflect the world outside its walls, diverse, complicated, and full of stories worth hearing. The first course arrived, served by the new staff. Each dish came with a story, narrated briefly by the chefs who prepared them. Amir, the refugee chef, stepped forward to present a fragrant lamb stew with saffron rice. His voice trembled at first, but grew steadier as he explained how the dish was inspired by the meals his mother had prepared before their family fled their home country. "This recipe kept us together," Amir said, his eyes shining. "It reminded us who we were when the world tried to make us forget." The applause was thunderous, and Henry felt a lump rise in his throat, but not all the attention was positive. At the back of the room, a familiar figure leaned against the wall. Mark Holden, the former manager Henry had fired. He watched the proceedings with a smirk, flanked by two of the security guards who had been dismissed alongside him. Henry's jaw tightened. Their presence was a reminder that not everyone was ready to embrace change. The tension came to a head midway through the banquet. During the main course, Mark approached one of the tables and began speaking loudly enough for others to hear. "Nice show you're putting on here," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Too bad it's all for appearances." The guests at the table exchanged uncomfortable glances, but Mark wasn't finished. This place used to mean something, now it's just a charity case. Henry rose from his seat, his heart pounding. He crossed the room and measured steps, aware that all eyes were on him. "Mark," he said evenly, "you're not welcome here." "Oh, I'm aware," Mark smirked, "but I thought I'd come see the circus for myself." "You think you're changing the world? You're just feeding scraps to people who can't afford the real thing." Murmurs rippled through the room. Henry clenched his fists, but Jenna stepped forward and touched his arm. "Let me handle this," she whispered. Before Henry could stop her, Jenna turned to face Mark. "You're right," she said, her voice clear and firm. "This place did mean something, but it meant the wrong things. Elitism, arrogance, and exclusion. That's what we're changing." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Jenna didn't give him the chance. "Now, unless you're here to support that change, I suggest you leave." A ripple of applause spread through the room, drowning out whatever retort Mark had planned. His face darkened, but he turned and stormed out, his former co-workers trailing behind him. Jenna turned back to Henry, her cheeks flushed. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be," Henry replied. "You were perfect." As the banquet continued, the energy in the room shifted. Guests relaxed, conversations flowed, and the barriers between them began to dissolve. The staff moved confidently through the space, their smiles genuine, their interactions warm. Henry watched it all, his chest swelling with pride. When the final course was served, a trio of desserts representing cultures from 3 continents, Henry took the stage. "Tonight is more than a reopening," he began, his voice steady. "It's a declaration." The room fell silent. This restaurant was built on the idea that excellence belongs to the few. But tonight proves that excellence can be shared, that dignity doesn't come with a price tag. He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "We've made mistakes. I've made mistakes. But this, what you see here tonight, this is what we stand for now. Inclusion, respect, community." Applause erupted, but Henry raised a hand. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's the beginning. And I hope you'll help us carry this vision forward." By the time the banquet ended, Henry felt lighter than he had in weeks. Guests lingered, exchanging contact information and ideas for future collaborations. As the last of them left, Henry turned to Jenna, who was stacking menus and clearing glasses. "We did it," she said, echoing her words from the night before. Henry smiled. "We did." But as he looked out at the empty room, he knew their work wasn't done. The banquet had proved that change was possible. Now they had to make it last. The sun rose over the city, casting a golden glow through the towering windows of the Golden Rose. The echoes of the previous night's applause still seemed to linger in the air, but the restaurant was quiet now. Too quiet. Henry stood at the center of the room, surveying the aftermath of the charity banquet. Empty glasses and plates remained scattered across the tables, evidence of conversations that had stretched late into the night. For a moment, he allowed himself to savor the triumph. The banquet had been more than an event. It had been a statement. The diverse crowd, the heartfelt speeches, and the applause had proven that the Golden Rose could be reborn as a place of inclusion and dignity. Yet, even as Henry smiled, doubt gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. The battle was far from over. The backlash began early the next morning. Social media erupted with posts accusing Henry of exploiting the marginalized for publicity. Former employees like Mark Holden fanned the flames, painting Henry as a manipulative businessman capitalizing on social justice trends. Anonymous reviews flooded online platforms, criticizing the restaurant's changes as performative and calling it a publicity stunt disguised as activism. But the criticism wasn't limited to words. When Henry arrived at the restaurant later that morning, he found graffiti scrawled across the glass doors, words like fraud and traitor splattered in red paint. Broken bottles and trash littered the entrance, and a note taped to the door read, "This isn't over." Henry's jaw tightened. He had expected resistance, but not like this. Jenna arrived moments later, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. "Are you kidding me?" she said, anger flashing across her face. Henry turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Call a cleaning crew. We'll have this cleaned up before we open." "That's it?" Jenna's voice rose. "We just wipe it off and pretend it didn't happen?" "No," Henry replied, his voice calm but firm. "We wipe it off and keep moving forward." But the pressure didn't stop there. Several investors expressed concern, questioning whether Henry's vision was financially sustainable. A board meeting was called, during which Henry faced pointed questions about the restaurant's profitability and long-term strategy. "What you're doing here is admirable, Henry," one of the board members said, her tone careful, "but admiration doesn't pay the bills." Henry met her gaze. "No, but integrity does. This restaurant was already profitable before we made these changes, and it will be profitable again." "And if it's not," another voice challenged, "then it'll be worth every penny we lose." His words hung in the air, met with a mix of silence and murmurs. Henry knew he had their attention, but whether he had their support remained to be seen. In the midst of the storm, Henry couldn't shake one lingering concern: Jenna. She had been his anchor throughout the transformation, but lately he had sensed a change in her. She was quieter, more distant, her smiles coming less frequently. One evening, as they locked up the restaurant, Henry finally confronted her. "Jenna," he said, stopping her before she could leave. "Is something wrong?" She hesitated, her hand resting on the door handle. "I don't know," she admitted. I thought this would feel different." "Different how?" "Less exhausting." She turned to face him, her eyes tired. "I believe in what we're doing, Henry. I do. But every day feels like a fight. And I guess I'm wondering if it'll ever stop feeling like that." Henry exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if it will," he admitted. "But I know what it feels like to give up. And I know I can't do that again." Jenna studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Neither can I." As the weeks passed, the noise began to die down. The graffiti was removed, the trash cleaned up, and the restaurant's reputation started to recover. More importantly, the staff began to settle into their roles, growing more confident with each shift. Customers returned, some out of curiosity, others because they believed in what the restaurant now represented. But Henry knew that reconciliation wasn't just about the restaurant. One afternoon, as he reviewed schedules in his office, a knock sounded at the door. He looked up to see Mark Holden standing there, his usual arrogance replaced by something closer to humility. "Got a minute?" Mark asked. Henry hesitated, then nodded. "Come in." Mark stepped inside, looking around as if seeing the office for the first time. He shifted awkwardly before speaking. "I messed up," he said finally. "And not just here, everywhere." Henry leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "What do you want, Mark?" "I want to fix it," Mark said. "Look, I was angry when you fired me. I felt humiliated. But after seeing what you've done here, the banquet, the changes, I get it now, and I want another chance." Henry studied him carefully, searching for signs of insincerity. "You put this place through hell," he said. "I know. You vandalized the restaurant." Mark looked down. "I didn't." Henry arched an eyebrow. "But I didn't stop the others either," Mark admitted. Silence hung between them. Finally, Henry spoke. "If I give you another chance, it won't be easy. You'll start at the bottom. No special treatment." Mark nodded quickly. "I wouldn't expect anything else." Henry extended a hand. "Don't make me regret this." Mark shook it. "I won't." By the end of the month, the restaurant had found its rhythm. The kitchen hummed with activity, the staff moving with confidence and purpose. Guests filled the tables, and the conversations that filled the air spoke of hope, change, and possibility. Henry stood at the edge of the room, watching as Jenna guided Mark through his new responsibilities. The former manager looked out of place in his busboy uniform, but he worked diligently, and Henry allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't perfection, but it was progress. Later that night, as Henry locked up the restaurant, Jenna joined him outside. "Still feel exhausted?" he asked. She laughed softly. "A little, but it's a good kind of exhausted." Henry nodded, gazing up at the glowing sign above the door. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But as long as they kept moving forward, he knew they were on the right path. The morning light spilled across the polished floors of the Golden Rose, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. It was quiet, peaceful in a way it hadn't been in months. The hum of chaos and uncertainty had faded, leaving behind a space filled with promise and renewal. Henry stood near the window, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. The restaurant had been transformed, but so had he. Gone was the man who had once taken pride in wealth and appearances, replaced by someone who had faced failure, humiliation, and doubt, and come out stronger on the other side. Behind him, the staff moved with practiced ease, setting tables and polishing silverware. The sound of laughter drifted from the kitchen, where Amir and the other chefs prepared for the day's service. The tension that had once gripped the restaurant had lifted, replaced by camaraderie and trust. Jenna appeared at his side, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "Morning, boss," she said, her tone light. "Morning," Henry replied, turning to face her. "How's everything looking?" "Perfect. Reservations are full, the staff's ready, and Amir says he's trying a new dessert tonight." Henry smiled. "Good." But Jenna didn't move. Instead, she shifted nervously, her fingers tapping the edge of the clipboard. "There's something else," she said. Henry raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "A call came in this morning," Jenna said. "Someone from the city council. They want to recognize the restaurant for community impact." Henry blinked. "You're serious?" Jenna grinned. "Completely." He exhaled, letting the news sink in. Recognition wasn't something he had sought, but hearing it felt like validation, not for himself, but for everyone who had stood beside him through the struggle. "Did you tell the staff yet?" he asked. "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first." Henry glanced toward the dining room where Carla was arranging the fresh flowers on the tables, and Mark, now in a neatly pressed uniform, was carefully folding napkins. "They deserve to know," Henry said. "All of them." Later that evening, as the restaurant filled with guests, Henry watched from a corner. The hum of conversation was different now, warmer, more genuine. Families laughed over shared plates, couples leaned close, and strangers struck up conversations. He spotted a man in worn jeans and a faded jacket sitting near the back. The man hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward the staff as if waiting to be told he didn't belong. Before anyone else could approach, Henry walked over and knelt beside the table. "Welcome to the Golden Rose," he said softly. The man's eyes widened. "You're the owner?" Henry nodded. "But I can't afford this place." "You don't need to," Henry said, sliding a menu across the table. "Dinner's on us tonight." The man's lip trembled, and he looked away, blinking rapidly. "Thank you," he whispered. Henry squeezed his shoulder and walked back to the kitchen. It wasn't the first time he had extended such an offer, and it wouldn't be the last. By the end of the night, Jenna found Henry in his office reviewing invoices. "Long day?" she asked. "A good one," Henry replied, leaning back in his chair. "What's up?" Jenna hesitated, then handed him an envelope. "What's this?" "Just open it." Henry tore it open and pulled out a handwritten note. "Henry, thank you for seeing something in me when I couldn't see it in myself. I'll never forget it. Mark." Henry stared at the note, his chest tightening. It wasn't much, just a few words, but it meant everything. "Looks like someone's grateful," Jenna said, leaning against the doorframe. "He should be," Henry replied with a small smile. "But so am I." The following weeks saw the Golden Rose flourish. Word of the restaurant's transformation spread, drawing more guests and even more attention. The staff grew more confident, their teamwork becoming seamless. Carla saved enough money to move into a better apartment with her daughter. Amir received an offer to publish a cookbook featuring his recipes. And Mark? He worked his way back up, proving that second chances could lead to something better. But for Henry, the real reward wasn't in profits or headlines. It was in the quiet moments, the look of relief on a man's face when he was given a warm meal, the laughter shared between coworkers who had once been strangers, the pride he felt watching Jenna step into her role as a leader. One evening, after the last guest had left, Henry and Jenna stood by the entrance, looking out at the city lights. "It feels different," Jenna said, echoing the words she'd spoken months ago. Henry glanced at her. "Different how?" "Like it matters," she replied. Henry smiled. "It always mattered." Jenna turned to face him, her expression softening. "Yeah, but now it feels real." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the weight of the journey settle between them. Then Jenna broke the silence. "So," she said, "what's next?" Henry chuckled. "We keep going, we keep growing, and we make sure this place keeps standing for something bigger than ourselves." Jenna nodded, her smile widening. "Partners?" she asked, extending her hand. Henry took it without hesitation. Partners. The next morning, Henry arrived at the restaurant early, as he always did, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing outside the door was a young woman holding a resume, her clothes neat but worn. She shifted nervously as Henry approached. "Can I help you?" he asked. I heard you're hiring," she said. "I know I don't have a lot of experience, but I'm a hard worker and I just need a chance." Henry studied her for a moment, seeing a reflection of the person he had once been. The uncertainty, the desperation, but also the determination. He smiled. "Come on in," he said, holding the door open. "Let's talk." As she stepped inside, Henry glanced up at the sign above the entrance. The Golden Rose. It had started as a symbol of wealth, but now it meant something more. It was a promise, a reminder that everyone deserved a place to feel seen, valued, and welcome. And as Henry followed the woman inside, he knew the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Thank you for watching this story to the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and leave your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to check out our other stories. They are waiting for you on the channel.